Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Huck. Today I'm doing my April wrap-up. So April was actually a really good reading month for me, both in quality and quantity. I enjoyed the majority of the books that I read. Most of them got around 4 stars. There were a couple that I didn't really love, but for the most part, really enjoyed my reading in April. And I read, how many? Hold on, I have to count this. 11 books, which for me is quite a lot. That is like the high end of what I can read in a month. So yes, it was a really good reading month and I'm excited to talk about these. Let's get started. The first book that I read in April was The Opal Deception by Owen Colfer, which is a middle grade series about Artemis Fowl, who is a boy genius and criminal mastermind. And this one, I have been kind of working my way through the series, kind of each month reading one of the books from the series, and I'm not sure if I'm going to continue with them. I've been enjoying them. Each one I give about 3.5 stars, which isn't like the worst. It's just sort of like, it's very lukewarm for me, and I'm not like totally DNFing the series. I may read it again at some point, but for the past few months, as I said, I've been reading like 1 to 2 of these every month for the past few months. And I don't think I'm going to keep that up. I might pick up this series again in the future. The next book that I picked up was Bloom by Kevin Panetta, and this is actually a graphic novel. You can see what the artwork looks like a little bit there, and I picked this up at the Nova Teen Book Festival, and I just recently hauled this video. I'll link that video down below because I hauled a whole bunch of books recently. And I don't usually read graphic novels. It's just not a medium that I find especially engaging for reading stories. But my friend who was with me had read this and really enjoyed it and recommended it, so I picked it up, and I did really enjoy this, and especially since I'm not usually a graphic novel person, this was one that even so I found it very engaging. It is about 2 boys who work in a bakery together and fall in love. One of them, his family owns the bakery, but he doesn't really want to work in the bakery, so he's trying to find someone to take over his duties at the bakery, and then he finds somebody to take over, and the 2 of them really hit it off. And this is Own Voices for the male-male romance, and I really enjoyed this. It is adorable. What I liked also about this is it is a very cute romance, but it's not overly cutesy. In my mind, there is a difference between something that is cute and something that is cutesy, and I think that it was very cute. I really enjoyed it, but it was not overly cutesy, and I think that it was done in a way that was still like adorable but very realistic, and I enjoyed it a lot, so I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Next, I binge read an entire trilogy, which was the Curse Worker trilogy by Holly Black, and I listened to all of these on audiobook, and they're pretty short books, so like it wasn't that difficult to binge read, and that's part of what made them so much fun. But also I was still kind of like impressed with myself that I binge read 3 books over the course of like 4 days. I got really into them, and these books kind of saturated my life for a short period of time. So these take place in a world like ours, but in this world there are curse workers, and curse workers are people who are able to put different kinds of curses on you. So there are different kinds of curse workers. There are luck workers, memory workers, death workers. There are a whole bunch of different kinds of curse workers, and so one person can only do one kind of curse work. Many curse workers are involved in criminal activity because they are kind of automatically considered criminals in this world, and so it has kind of a mafia feel to it. Our main character, Castle, is from a long line of curse working family, and so his whole family are different kinds of curse workers and have varying degrees of contact with this kind of curse working mafia that's going on. But Castle is not a curse worker. He's the only one in his family who is not, and so he feels very left out in that way. But even so, Castle does have some dark stuff in his past and some things that he has done that are illegal, but he is trying to live a normal life now. However, at the beginning of this first book, he gets sucked back into the turmoil of this world and criminal activity, and these books were just so enjoyable. I don't know exactly why, but I just really loved them. They were they're so much fun. I really liked the magic system of curse working. I thought it was really interesting. I thought it was interesting the way that they had blowback, which was that if you use your curse work, then you kind of get an equal reaction from whatever you've done. So people who are memory workers, they can remove memories from people, but then they slowly start to lose their own memories and things like that. And it was really interesting to see the different ways that the blowback manifested in different people for different kinds of curse work. Anyways, it was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed just binging this series. Highly recommend it. I gave each book in the series 4 out of 5 stars. Then I listened to Scrappy Little Nobody by Anna Kendrick, which is, I guess, kind of like a memoir of Anna Kendrick's life. And the audiobook is a lot of fun because it is narrated by Anna Kendrick. So it's really fun to hear her stories and her jokes in her own voice, because then she like delivers them, you know, the way that they're meant to be. She hits all the right beats. It's so fun to like listen to her tell all of her stories. I find Anna Kendrick very funny, and I just had a really fun time listening to her book, and I learned a lot about her, sometimes a little bit more than I really wanted to know, but overall it was a really fun read, and I gave this also 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read 2 books of poetry, which were both by the same author, which were Wildly Into the Dark and All the Words Are Yours, both by Tyler Knott Gregson. And I have recently started to really love Tyler Knott Gregson's poetry. I read one of his books last year, which was Chasers of the Light, and really enjoyed it, but I wasn't like totally sold. And then I read Wildly Into the Dark, and I really loved it. I really like the way that he uses metaphor and imagery. One of the things that I especially liked about this also is that there were a lot of poems in here that I loved, and I was marking up my book, highlighting the ones that I really enjoyed. But then there were also a lot of poems in here that I could read and think of other people I knew who would like these. And I had one of my friends I would like take pictures of poems and send them to my friend Kathleen because I knew that she would like them, even though she and I have kind of different taste in poetry and what kind of poetry we want, like what we want out of poetry. So one of the things that I like about his poetry is that it has range, that it can appeal to a lot of different people, and that there were so many poems in here that, like, even if they weren't ones that I personally loved, although there were plenty of those, there were a lot that I also knew other people would like as well, and I enjoyed that kind of range in his poetry. So this is more like his regular poetry that's kind of like medium to long poems, and then All the Words Are Yours are haikus. So these are much shorter, and haikus are not my favorite kind of poetry, but since I've been enjoying his poetry so much, I decided to pick this one up, and I liked this one a lot. I think I liked these haikus more than I've liked most other haikus, although I think that this is still probably my favorite book of poetry by Tyler Knott Gregson. But I gave both of these 4 out of 5 stars. So you can see a trend. I have had a lot of 4-star books this month. After that though, it did take a little bit of a downturn because I had my most disappointing book of the month, which was Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. And I was buddy reading this with Jocelyn from Yogi with the Book, and we were reading this for Tome Topple because this is definitely a Tome Topple worthy book. It is quite chunky and very dense. Neither of us really enjoyed this book, but it was a lot of fun to, you know, buddy read it with Jocelyn, and, you know, we had very similar opinions about it, so at least we could both gripe about this book together as we were reading through it. And I don't think that I would have gotten through this by myself. I definitely would not have finished this without having Jocelyn to talk to about this. So I'm glad that we buddy read it together. But there were a lot of things that I was not a fan of with this one. One is just that, like, there's no plot to this book, and we all know by now that, like, I'm not the most plot-driven person, that if there are characters that I can get attached to, or characters at least that grow and change over the course of the book, then I can be really on board. This had none of those things. So there was no plot, there were no characters that I was attached to, and none of the characters that were in it grew or changed or developed or learned like anything over the course of this book. It also also felt like we were following the least interesting characters in the entire book who did the least interesting things. I also really dislike the treatment of female characters in this book. There aren't very many of them, but the ones that are there are not treated very well by the main characters, Jonathan Strange or Mr. Norrell. And some of the female characters, I think the mistreatment of them, there is a purpose, which is to kind of illustrate things about the character of like Jonathan Strange or Mr. Norrell and the ways that they view and treat other human beings. But still, I don't like that the purpose of the female characters is to be mistreated in order to tell us things about the male characters. I also thought there were a lot of things in here that were handled very insensitively, especially when talking about other cultures or people of other races or cultures or countries. I felt like they were written about very insensitively, and maybe the way that they were written about would have been accurate to the time period that this story is set, and yet I felt like it still could have been done with more sensitivity and more finesse, especially since this is a modern author writing for a modern audience, and I don't think that the way that she handled it was done very well. I also thought that the handling of madness or mental illness in this was done very poorly. It was treated as something that was kind of like fun and could be used to get what you want, and it's another example of how she treats things insensitively in this story. So there are just a lot of things that I was not a fan of. Also, just as a story, there are a lot of storylines and characters that are just dropped, and plot lines that are just dropped and never come back to. So in that way, I also just feel like it's kind of poor storytelling. Oh, also something I have to mention is like the magic in this just was so annoying, because the magic is a central part of the story because we're following two magicians. But one, very little magic happens in this, and that was frustrating. But two, the magic is not explained at all. And what bothers me about that is that the magic in this is described as something that they treat it almost like a science. And they study it, and it is considered it's very ritualistic in the style of magic. But they never actually explain to us anything about how the magic works, if there are any rules or systems, if there are any limits to the magic. And so magic happens very rarely, but when it does, it seems like it just comes out of nowhere and there's no explanation, there's no rhyme or reason to how the magic works, why it works, like there's nothing. And I find that very frustrating as a fantasy reader, because to me, you have to have consistency. If it's going to be a story that is based on a more like intuitive magic system that doesn't have a lot of like rules and structure, that's fine, but you have to set that up from the beginning. But this was set up as a more process focused, like ritualistic style magic system that would be more detailed and systematic, and yet we got none of that information. Anyways, clearly there are a lot of things that I didn't like about this. I gave it 2 out of 5 stars. I found it hard to rate because I was just like I feel like nothing even happened anyway, so it's like almost difficult to rate this book at all. I'm glad that I read it though, because this is one that's been on my TBR, my like mental TBR, for a very long time. I've always had my eye on it and always kind of wondered about it. So I'm glad that I read it. Now I know I don't like it. Next, I read Inkheart by Cornelia Funk. I actually listened to this as an audiobook, but I have the physical book as well, obviously. And this is another one that I just recently hauled. This is a middle grade book that is a book about books. I've been wanting to read more books about books. So this definitely has a very heavy like book theme to it. It follows a young girl named Maggie and her father Mo. And Mo has the magical ability to read things out of books. So as he's reading, he can read different characters or items out of the books. And a long time ago, he accidentally read some villains out of one of the books, and they have kind of been running wild in the world since then, and he has been in hiding. And then more recently, the villains have come back to find Mo and Maggie. And that's kind of what starts off this story. Really adorable. I do plan to read the rest of the series. I think this is a trilogy, so I'm planning to read the rest of them. I have the next audiobook for Inkspell, the second book, on hold right now, on my Libby app, so I'm looking forward to that. And I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars, so another 4-star book for this month. And the last book that I read in April was Wolfskin by Juliet Marillier. This is a reread for me. It's the first book in the Light Isles duology, and technically I finished this on May 1st, but we are counting it as an April book because I read most of it in April. So this follows Eyvind, who wants to become a wolfskin. So this is a historical fantasy that takes place in a Norse setting. And so our main character worships Thor. He wants to become a wolfskin and go Viking. He wants to go on adventures and fight in battles and win honor for himself and his god and his king and all of that. And it follows actually 2 friends who grow up together. And someone mentioned, I can't remember where, if it was on a video or an Instagram post, that this had kind of like a Thor-Loki friendship dynamic in it. And I think that that's true to a certain extent, because there are definitely, it follows these 2 boys who grow up together. One of them is the one who wants to become a wolfskin. He's very like tall and blonde, and he is maybe not as smart, but he wants to go fight and like win honor, and he's like a very honorable person. And then he has his friend who is a little bit smaller, has dark hair, is more like clever and witty and tricky and kind of willing to do whatever he needs to get ahead. And he also wants to become a king. So there's definitely some parallels between like Thor and Loki and these 2 characters. However, I think that the character that is sort of the Loki-like character has all of Loki's bad traits and then some, and then none of his good traits that make him endearing. So I really did not enjoy him, whereas I do enjoy Loki in the like Marvel movies version of Thor and Loki. So that was something that I think kind of slowed me down on this a little bit. This book overall took me a very long time to read. It took me over a month to read this, which is very long for me. Usually a book that's like this, you know, it's about 500 pages, but it's like a mass market paperback, usually would take me, I don't know, maybe a week, probably under a week to read, but it took me over a month to read this. Part of it is because I put it down while I was reading for Tome Topple, but even so, up to that point, I had already been reading it for a couple of weeks, which was very long for me. I think part of that is because throughout the story, there is this very like ominous feeling. It's very foreboding. There is a lot of very heavy-handed foreshadowing that happens in this. So there's a lot of stuff that you go like, oh, this is gonna come back to bite them. This is going to, like, you know that you're just waiting and waiting for everything to fall apart, for everything to go bad. And also, again, because I was not that engaged with the characters, I think that the main character, who's the one that's more similar to like a Thor type character, has the potential to be an interesting character, and I think he really did grow over the course of the book, and he became a much more interesting character by the end of it. But the first half, I was not very interested in him, and then the other character is the one who's sort of like a Loki equivalent, except like worse, and I just didn't like him at all. The second half became much more interesting. They end up in a new land and they meet new people. We introduce a new main character who is kind of like a local priestess type character who is more similar to the types of characters that I think Juliet Marillier usually writes. And I really enjoyed that character. And after that character was introduced, I think the story really started moving along better. I liked that character and I think that she was really interesting and I felt more engaged in the book because of that. And also her introduction into the story was somewhat like a catalyst for some of the other character development that happened for other characters. So I think that really made a difference as well. Anyways, I ended up giving this actually a 3.75 stars because I really liked the ending. I thought it had a really strong ending, the way that everything came together. It incorporated a favorite myth of mine actually, and I feel like the characters really grew a lot over the course of the story, especially the main character. I thought he had a lot of character growth, and so I do plan to reread the second book as well. I'm really interested to see how his character development continues. So that is all for the books that I read in April. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, bye!